The sleek glass and steel architecture of the KTN Broadcasting Building gleamed like a futuristic beacon against the warm amber glow of the setting California sun. Inside Studio 7, the air hummed with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled machine, camera operators adjusting their equipment with practiced precision, makeup artists making final touches, and production assistants scurrying about with clipboards and wireless headsets. The studio lights cast a harsh, unforgiving glare on the empty interview set, where two leather chairs faced each other like adversaries preparing for battle. In the green room, Jason Hayes checked his reflection one final time, adjusting his designer tie with manicured fingers. At 34, Hayes had become the network's rising star, his interview series Unfiltered drawing millions of viewers with its provocative style and Hayes' signature ability to make even the most composed celebrities reveal more than they intended. His producer had labeled it journalistic acupuncture, finding the precise pressure points that would make subjects crack open like oysters, revealing the pearls of controversy hidden within. 5 minutes, Mr. Hayes, called a production assistant, her voice carrying the familiar blend of deference and urgency that surrounded on-air talent. Hayes nodded without looking away from the mirror. Is he here? Yes, sir. Mr. Eastwood arrived 10 minutes ago. A small, satisfied smile tugged at the corner of Hayes's mouth. Getting Clint Eastwood on Unfiltered had been something of a coup. The Hollywood legend was notoriously selective about interviews, especially as he approached his 93rd year. But Hayes had connections, and more importantly, he had leverage. A promised spotlight on Eastwood's latest directorial project. A film the studios were already whispering might be his last great work. What Eastwood didn't know was that Hayes had a different interview in mind entirely. Clint Eastwood sat quietly in his private waiting room, hands resting lightly on his knees, his weathered face a map of years lived fully and unapologetically. His breathing was slow and measured, a habit formed through decades of working in front of and behind the camera. To the young production assistant who had shown him in, he appeared almost meditative, though if she could have glimpsed beneath that calm exterior, she might have seen the keen awareness and evaluation that had never left him, even in his 9th decade. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. 2 minutes, Mr. Eastwood, called a voice. Thank you, he replied, his famous rasp quiet but clear. As he rose from his chair with the deliberate movements of a man who refused to be hurried by age or expectation, Eastwood considered, not for the first time, whether he should have agreed to this interview. His publicist had insisted Hayes was the voice of a new generation, and that appearing on Unfiltered would help connect his film to younger audiences. Eastwood had his doubts. He'd been in this business long enough to recognize hungry eyes when he saw them, and Hayes had the look of a man seeking to make his name by tearing down others. But the film mattered to him, perhaps more than any other he'd made. So here he was. If you're enjoying this story, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. We bring you new content like this every week, and your support helps us continue sharing these powerful narratives. As Eastwood made his way toward the studio, he felt a peculiar sensation, like the heightened awareness that came before a thunderstorm when the air grew heavy with unspent electricity. Something about this interview felt wrong, off balance somehow. At his age, he'd learned to trust these instincts. They'd rarely led him astray. The studio audience fell silent as Clint Eastwood walked onto the set, his tall frame still commanding despite the slight stoop of age. A respectful applause rose to greet him, echoing against the high ceiling and then fading as he settled into the guest chair opposite Hayes. The cameras panned across the scene, the young, polished interviewer with his practiced smile, and the legendary director, a study in contrast that made for compelling television. Ladies and gentlemen, Hayes began, his voice sliding into the smooth, practiced cadence he was known for. Tonight, we have the rare privilege of speaking with one of Hollywood's most enduring icons, director, actor, composer, and two-term mayor of Carmel by the Sea, California. Please welcome Mr. Clint Eastwood. Another round of applause, which Eastwood acknowledged with a slight nod and that famous half smile that had graced movie screens for over 6 decades. Thank you for making time for us, Hayes continued. I know you don't do many of these appearances anymore. Well, Eastwood replied, his voice a gravelly whisper that nonetheless carried clearly through the studio, when you reach my age, You get selective about how you spend your time. A ripple of appreciative laughter moved through the audience. Your new film, The Last Light, opens next week, Hayes began, settling into his chair. It tells the story of a retired lighthouse keeper confronting his past. Was this story personal for you in some way? Eastwood nodded, relaxing slightly as the conversation turned to his work. All stories become personal when you invest yourself in them. This one spoke to me about legacy, about what we leave behind and what we take with us. For the next few minutes, the interview proceeded pleasantly enough, with questions about the film, the challenges of directing at 93, and Eastwood's thoughts on the changing landscape of cinema. The audience remained engaged, leaning forward in their seats, drawn into the conversation between the eager interviewer and the laconic legend. But beneath the surface politeness, an undercurrent was building. Hayes kept glancing at his notes, then at a small monitor visible only to him. His questions began to take subtle turns, moving away from the film and toward more personal territory. "You've been in the public eye for what, 7 decades now?" Hayes asked, leaning forward slightly. "That's a lot of history to witness from the inside." Eastwood nodded, his eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. "Yes, it is. You've seen Hollywood transform completely, from the studio system to streaming. You've watched America change through civil rights, Vietnam, multiple recessions, cultural revolutions." Hayes paused, building tension before continuing. "And your own politics have shifted dramatically over that time as well, haven't they?" There it was, the first hint of the real interview Hayes had planned. The slight stiffening of Eastwood's shoulders would have been invisible to most, but to the careful observer, it signaled recognition of the trap being laid. "I wouldn't say dramatically," Eastwood replied, his voice even. "I've always valued personal freedom and responsibility. The labels change more than the values do." Hayes smiled, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. "Yet you've moved from endorsing Democratic candidates to becoming something of a Republican icon. Particularly memorable was your, shall we say, unconventional speech at the 2012 Republican National Convention." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The audience, sensing the shift, grew utterly still. "You're referring to the empty chair?" Eastwood stated flatly. "Yes, the now famous empty chair speech, where you spent nearly 12 minutes having an imaginary conversation with then-President Obama, represented by an empty chair on stage." Hayes pulled up an image on the studio's large screen. Eastwood on stage pointing at an empty chair, his face animated in mid-sentence. Many found it disrespectful to the office of the presidency. Eastwood's face remained impassive. It was political theater, imperfect perhaps, but sincere. "Some called it the ramblings of an old man losing his grip," Hayes pressed, his voice taking on an edge of challenge. "The New Yorker called it sad and embarrassing. Would you agree in hindsight that it damaged your legacy?" The studio grew so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. Even the camera operators exchanged uncomfortable glances. This was not the respectful film discussion that had been promised. Eastwood studied Hayes for a long moment, his pale blue eyes revealing nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before, forcing everyone to listen more carefully. "Young man, I've been having my legacy damaged and repaired and rewritten since before you were born. The wonderful thing about being 93 is that you stop spending much time worrying about things like that." A few nervous chuckles from the audience broke the tension momentarily, but Hayes was not deterred. He touched his earpiece briefly, nodding at some unheard instruction. "Let's talk about some of your films then," Hayes continued, his tone suggesting casual interest, while his posture telegraphed the opposite. "Many of your early works glorified a very specific type of masculine violence. Dirty Harry, for instance, was criticized for its apparent fascist undertones and promotion of police brutality. In today's climate of police reform and accountability, how do you respond to critics who say your films helped romanticize the shoot-first mentality?" The question hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. This was not an interview about a new film. This was an ambush designed to create a viral moment at the expense of an aging icon. Eastwood's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle hardening around the eyes that those who knew him well would recognize as danger. but his voice, when he responded, remained controlled. Films reflect and examine their times, just as questions do, he said. Those movies spoke to an era when people felt vulnerable and abandoned by systems that were supposed to protect them. Much like today, actually. He paused, looking directly into Hayes's eyes. But I suspect you're less interested in that nuance than in getting a quote you can use for your promotions? Hayes's smile tightened. I'm interested in honest conversation, Mr. Eastwood. Your films shaped cultural perceptions of masculinity and justice for generations. Surely that's worth examining? Examining, yes. Reducing to gotcha moments, no. Eastwood shifted in his chair, his discomfort now visible. I was told this interview would focus on the last light. We'll get to that, Hayes assured him with practiced sincerity. But our audience expects Unfiltered to go deeper. Speaking of Unfiltered, he glanced down at his tablet. You once told a reporter that this generation, and I quote, is the pussy generation. Everybody's walking on eggshells, afraid of saying what they think will hurt somebody's feelings. Do you stand by those comments? A murmur ran through the audience. The producer in the control room leaned forward, recognizing the moment they'd been hoping for. Controversy that would drive social media engagement for days. Eastwood was silent for a long moment, looking not at Hayes but past him, as if seeing something beyond the glaring studio lights and eager cameras. When he finally turned his gaze back to his interviewer, there was something in it that made Hayes involuntarily straighten in his chair. You know, Eastwood said quietly, one of the first things you learn in filmmaking is the difference between creating something of value and simply creating noise. He looked around the studio, taking in the cameras, the lights, the audience now hanging on his every word. This isn't an interview. It's a performance designed to elevate you at someone else's expense. Hayes's expression flickered between surprise and defensiveness. Mr. Eastwood, I assure you. No, Eastwood interrupted, his voice suddenly firm and clear. You can't assure me of anything, because you're not being honest. Not with me, not with your audience, and probably not with yourself. With slow, deliberate movements, Eastwood reached up and began removing his microphone. The studio fell into shocked silence. What are you doing? Hayes asked, alarm creeping into his voice as he realized his big moment was unraveling. Something I should have done earlier, Eastwood replied, placing the microphone carefully on the small table between them. I'm walking away from a bad scene. He stood tall and straight despite his years, a lifetime of commanding film sets evident in his bearing. I've directed enough movies to recognize when a scene isn't working, and I respect my audience too much to waste their time with something false. Hayes rose as well, panic now clearly visible beneath his polished veneer. Mr. Eastwood, please. We still have 15 minutes of airtime to fill. Eastwood paused, looking at Hayes with what might almost have been pity. Then I suggest you use it to figure out what kind of journalist you want to be. One who illuminates or one who simply inflames. And with that, Clint Eastwood turned and walked off the set, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. No dramatics, no raised voice, no slammed doors. Just the dignity of a man who had chosen not to participate in his own ambush. In the control room, chaos erupted. The producer was shouting into his headset. Technicians were scrambling for contingency plans, and the network executive who had approved the interview format had gone pale. On set, Hayes stood frozen, the cameras still rolling, capturing his expression of disbelief and growing awareness that this moment, which was indeed going viral as they'd hoped, was not painting him in the heroic light he'd imagined. The audience, initially shocked, had begun a slow, steady applause for Eastwood's exit. Cut to commercial, the producer finally ordered, his voice strained. Cut to commercial now. But it was too late. The damage, or perhaps the triumph, depending on one's perspective, was done. The red recording lights remained on just long enough to capture Jason Hayes' face as he realized what had happened. In that unguarded moment, the carefully constructed persona fell away, revealing something raw and surprisingly vulnerable. A young man suddenly confronted with the consequences of his ambition. 3 floors above the studio, in a small private elevator, Clint Eastwood stood alone, his expression unreadable. There was no anger in his posture, no visible indignation or hurt, only the quiet centeredness of a man who had seen enough of life to know which battles were worth fighting and which were better left behind. As the elevator doors opened to the executive floor, he was surprised to find a young woman waiting, clipboard in hand. She couldn't have been more than 25, her eyes wide with what might have been admiration or anxiety. "Mr. Eastwood," she began, her voice unsteady, "I'm Emma Chen, junior content producer. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry about what happened down there." Eastwood studied her for a moment. "Were you part of planning that interview?" She shook her head, curls bouncing with the vehemence of her denial. "No, sir. I just started 2 weeks ago. But I was in the control room and—" She hesitated, clearly torn between professional discretion and personal integrity. "What they did wasn't right." He nodded, stepping out of the elevator. "Not your apology to make, then." "No, but—" She hesitated again. "I studied film at UCLA. Your work is why I wanted to get into this industry, to tell stories that matter." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Not whatever that was down there." Something in her earnestness seemed to reach through Eastwood's reserve. The corner of his mouth lifted in that famous half-smile. "The industry has always had its haze types," he said. "Always will, but it has the other kind too, the ones who care about the work itself." He nodded toward her. "Focus on being that second kind." She nodded, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. "Can I ask, what will you do now?" "About the film promotion, I mean." For the first time since leaving the studio, Eastwood laughed, a short, genuine sound that transformed his weathered face. "I've been in this business since 1954. One bad interview won't kill a good film." Emma smiled, relief visible in her expression. Then, gathering her courage, she added, "The thing is, sir, I don't think it was a bad interview for you. Everyone in the control room was, well, they were stunned by how you handled it." "How's that?" "With dignity," she said simply. "It's already trending. Eastwood Walks is #1 on Twitter, and the clips are everywhere. People are saying it might be your best performance in years." Eastwood shook his head, equal parts amused and bemused by the mechanisms of modern fame. "Wasn't trying to perform." "Maybe that's why it worked," she suggested, with the intuitive insight of youth. Back in Studio 7, after an emergency commercial break extended to 3 times its normal length, a visibly shaken Jason Hayes faced the cameras again. Gone was the smug confidence, the practiced charm. In its place was something unexpected, an authenticity born of public humiliation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice lacking its usual polish, "as you've just witnessed, Mr. Eastwood has left our interview. And after some reflection during our break, I can't say I blame him." A murmur rippled through the audience. "This show is called Unfiltered," Hayes continued, "and in the interest of living up to that name, I'm going to be unfiltered with you now." He took a deep breath. "I had an agenda tonight that had very little to do with Mr. Eastwood's new film and everything to do with creating a viral moment at his expense." The studio fell silent, every person there witnessing something rare in modern media, an admission of manipulation from the manipulator himself. "I could blame my producers, our ratings pressure, the algorithms that reward controversy over substance, and all of that would be partially true." Hayes looked directly into the main camera. "But the full truth is simpler. I prioritized my ambition over my integrity. And in doing so, I disrespected not only a Hollywood legend, but all of you watching as well." He gestured to the empty chair across from him, an ironic echo of Eastwood's controversial RNC moment years earlier. What should have happened in this chair tonight was a thoughtful conversation about a film that, by all accounts, represents a master filmmaker's meditation on legacy and mortality. Instead, I tried to create conflict for clicks. Hayes paused, visibly struggling with what to say next. When he continued, his voice had lost the performance quality entirely, becoming simply that of a man facing a hard truth. "The worst part is, I'm not sure I know how to do it any other way anymore. Somewhere along the line, I stopped being a journalist and became—" He gestured vaguely at himself. "Whatever this is." The control room producer was frantically signaling through Hayes's earpiece. But for perhaps the first time in his career, Hayes wasn't listening to the voices telling him how to perform. He was finding his own. "So here's what we're going to do," he said, straightening his shoulders. "I'm going to end this episode early. No replacement guest, no filler content. But I promise you this, the next time we meet in the studio, it will be with a different approach. Because if there's one thing we can all learn from Clint Eastwood, it's that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply walk away from what doesn't serve your better self." He looked again at the empty chair, a tangible symbol of his failed ambush turned unexpected moment of growth. "Mr. Eastwood, if you're watching, though I suspect you have better things to do, thank you for the unintended lesson. And I sincerely hope audiences will judge your film on its merits, not on this interview's failure." With that, Hayes nodded to the camera operator, signaling the end of the broadcast. As the on-air lights dimmed, the studio remained hushed, the audience unsure whether they had witnessed a career suicide or a rebirth. 1 week later, The Last Light opened to critical acclaim and strong box office numbers, buoyed in part by the publicity generated by Eastwood's dignified exit from Unfiltered. The interview clip had indeed gone viral, but not as Hayes had originally intended. Instead of capturing an aging icon's meltdown, it had documented a masterclass in boundary setting and authentic communication. In a small screening room at his ranch in Carmel, Eastwood sat watching the early box office reports with his longtime producer, Robert Lorenz. The numbers were scrolling across the bottom of the entertainment news segment, currently discussing yet again the walkout that changed entertainment journalism. "Think you might have accidentally started a movement, boss," Lorenz commented, gesturing to the TV where a round table of media critics were earnestly discussing the ethics of gotcha journalism in the streaming era. Eastwood shrugged, the movement spare and economical like his directing style. "Didn't start anything, just ended something that needed ending. Well, whatever you want to call it, the film's benefiting." Lorenz handed over a tablet displaying the latest numbers. "We're tracking 20% above projections." Eastwood glanced at the figures, then set the tablet aside. "Good for the investors," he said, but his tone suggested the numbers weren't what mattered to him. "You know," Lorenz said carefully, "Hayes has been reaching out daily, requesting a do-over. His producer says he's had some kind of epiphany." "Man's entitled to his epiphanies," Eastwood replied. "Doesn't mean I need to be part of them." Lorenz nodded, knowing better than to push. After 3 decades of working together, he'd learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when his friend and colleague had made up his mind. The news segment shifted to a clip of Hayes on a morning show, looking humbled and speaking about his plans to reformat Unfiltered into something more substantive. "I realized I'd become what I originally set out to critique," he was saying. "It took someone from a different generation to show me how far I'd strayed from the basics of respect and journalistic integrity." Eastwood made a small non-committal sound and reached for the remote, clicking off the television. "Not interested in his redemption arc?" Lorenz asked. "Man's journey is his own," Eastwood replied. "I wish him well with it. Just don't need to watch it unfold." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two men who had built careers on understanding that what's left unsaid is often as important as what's spoken aloud. Finally, Eastwood rose from his chair with the deliberate movements of a man who refused to be hurried by age or expectation, the same quality that had served him on the Unfiltered set. "You know what this whole circus reminds me of?" he asked, moving to the window that overlooked the rugged Carmel coastline. "What's that?" Lorenz asked. "Something my father told me when I was maybe 20, struggling to find my way." Eastwood gazed out at the landscape, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the hills. He said, "Right or wrong, a man has to be who he is. The other choice is to be nothing at all." He turned back to Lorenz, his expression thoughtful. "All these years later, that still strikes me as about right. Hayes was trying to be something he wasn't. Maybe now he'll figure out who he actually is." "And you?" Lorenz asked. "Was walking off that set being true to who you are?" Eastwood's face creased in that familiar half-smile that had captivated audiences for generations. "At 93, if you haven't figured out when to stay and when to walk away, you haven't been paying attention." As the sun began its descent toward the Pacific, Casting golden light across the screening room, both men turned their attention back to what had always mattered most to them. Not the drama, or the headlines, or the viral moments, but the work itself, the stories worth telling, the light that remains when everything else fades to black. On screens across America, The Last Light continued to play to appreciative audiences. Its quiet power, a testament to a filmmaker who had always understood that the most important statements rarely need to be shouted, and that sometimes the most powerful scene is the one where a character simply chooses to walk away.